Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, beluga whales, from Hudson Bay to the high Arctic, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Kristina Disney. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Kristina, take it away.
Thank you so much, Rob, and thank you everyone for joining in today. Apologies about the no webcam. There's some technical difficulties, I think, on GoToWebinar side. Hopefully we'll have it resolved in time for tomorrow. But as it is, thank you so much for joining. If this is your first interlude into the world of belugas over the last month or so, thanks so much for tuning in. If you've been following along, we are on part 3. This is all in lead up to beluga season that happened actually to have started in Churchill today, everyone. Today is the very first trip that is leaving. Time-wise, it has left. It would have taken off, their welcome dinner will be tonight, and they will be flying up in the morning tomorrow morning. So this is it. Our beluga season is on, it's live, it's hot, and I'll be joining them July 30th. So this is the last time to talk about belugas before we get to go see them, which is really great. If anyone is tuning in ahead of their trip, that's awesome. I'm so excited that you're nerding out with us and you're learning a little bit about these absolutely stunning, beautiful social creatures. And can't wait to go see them splash around in real life. So just a quick recap of our last couple sessions before we dive into today's webinar. For anyone who was with us in part 1, we actually spent a lot of time thinking about the inside of a beluga's body. Maybe not the part that comes to mind for the first part, but it's because, right, these are marine mammals and they, like us, need to breathe air, but they have all these amazing adaptations in order to achieve that. And so one of the things we were talking about was things with breath holds and how that controls their dive time, which essentially controls their whole life. Right? And we were really talking internally, we're talking about their hemoglobin, how their blood is carrying oxygen, and how one of the things that researchers are noticing is that there's a reduction in body size. And what that is resulting in is it's resulting in a loss in diving time. That makes a big difference if your average time is, if your average time is around 10 minutes, whereas, some of the records ones for belugas we've recorded them about 23 minutes. But again, if most of your diving bouts for food are in that 4 to 6 to 10 range, if you lose a minute of diving time for every 10% of your body mass that you're no longer reaching, that makes a big deal. And so we're just talking about how these sort of rippling effects, which affect one body system, then affect foraging behavior. And, we talk about positive feedback loops, right? And so it's a really big thing in ecology. And we kind of walked through how that played out in a beluga's life. So that was what we did in part 1. Feel free to jump back in if you'd missed it or do a review if you're still curious about some of those things. Part 2, we spent a lot more time looking at their ecosystem. So I love maps of the Arctic, sort of looking, quote unquote, from the top down. Not that our lovely sphere has a top, but psychologically we tend to think about it that way because we use the north-south orientation. So if we look at it from down or from space, looking at the poles, as this map is trying to portray, we have all of these rivers that feed into the Arctic, and those rivers have huge effects on it, right? They're the reason why the Arctic is less salty than all of our other oceans. They move in large amounts of nutrients. The shape of the Arctic basin itself actually contains some of that, and so it all comes together, right? We think about the effects on a species and we think about these interactions between species, but sometimes we don't even think about these geological effects, right? And that's kind of also a little bit of what I'm going to dabble in today. But I want to kind of bring it back in. Also, what we talked about in part 2 was we sort of localized that river system, and we started talking about the Churchill River. We started talking about Western Hudson's Bay and those populations there. And one thing I was really stoked to show everyone was some research that was done with National Geographic in 2022, and just some really beautiful, it was photography, but they did transects in Hudson's Bay and actually got to show us some of the life under the sea there, which I know if you are from somewhere coastal further south, that might not seem as big and exciting. But in the Arctic, this is really cool to get to see because A, half of our year is covered in sea ice, so we can't even see it if we want to. But B, all of our coastline, which is maybe something you hadn't had to think about if you're not from a world of ice and snow where the oceans can freeze, is that sea ice actually scrapes away a lot of the life close to shore. So even though where I live right now, I'm calling in from Vancouver today, I can go for a walk on a beach and I can see some of these things in an intertidal zone. The intertidal zones in the subarctic look like Mars because everything there, it has to recolonize every year. You know, might see a little bit of algae, you might see a little bit of things, but it's not like roaming on the beach in a warmer climate where you get to find life. Life is really negated in that section, which is a big opposite. Normally intertidal zones are huge. They're these biodiversity blooms, but ours have to retreat to a point, or they're only be able to be consistent to a point where they're deep water that sea ice doesn't scour it away. So I was really stoked and I was really excited to share with everyone what Hudson's Bay looks like below the surface. And that includes, you know, some of our pelagic friends. This here is a picture of a capelin. So that's one of the major food sources for belugas that are hanging out in the Hudson's Bay. And so we did some cool stuff. We were talking about eDNA and how in the, you know, they were doing photography and you know, physical transects, but how you can just take little sample vials of water, and in that little particles, it doesn't take much, you know, a few scraps of a scale, even a little bit of feces, things like that, and they can use that to find out which animals have been in the area within a certain amount of time. So that's one of the ways they found belugas. They even found, which is really rare but really cool, some genetics or some DNA, excuse me, left over from an orca. So again, orcas are very rarely sighted in Hudson's Bay, but they have been increasingly more common as that sea ice stays open longer, and they are a predator to belugas. So that interaction is changing. It is already changing and becoming more frequent. So really amazing that their eDNA study was able to do that. So today we're thinking about where belugas are in that food web, and I was talking about how the last couple of times how belugas come to Hudson's Bay, they migrate there, right? So our belugas, they do really long migrations. So if you look, there's a little green star that you can see. And so that's where Churchill is roughly on Hudson's Bay. And then you have the two color codes here. So you have the summering is in the hashed, and then you have the yellow, which is all year round. So this is showing you a pan-Arctic distribution of the belugas. There's roughly, again, population estimates are really hard with marine mammals, but again, somewhere between 160 to maybe 200,000. And we find 50,000 of those in the Western Hudson Bay population. So that's a huge amount. That's, depending on how you want to look at that, that's up to a quarter or a third of our global population. And all of these, as you look at them here, right? So as you can see, some populations have summering grounds and some seem to be all year round. So some of those migrations are up to 2,500 kilometers. Some of them are quite local and they're residents. So they might only do a short migration, or they might actually be able to live in the same area all year round. And that's based on a few different things. It's based on temperature of water, food availability, rearing habitat for their calves, things like that. So if we want to take a look at where are our belugas traveling, this kind of gives you an idea of the route they take. So they actually don't often go into the middle of Hudson's Bay. They are generally feeding on either pelagic species like capelin that I showed you earlier, or they're actually vacuuming the bottom. It's one of my favorite things. They have these quite mobile lips, and they can suck up things along the bottom, from sandworms to different mollusks, even octopus if they can get their hands on them, get their lips on them, get their fins on them. I don't know, there's a pun in there somewhere if I think it through. So this is where they're traveling. So that's part of the reason why they're staying along the edge there. It's food availability, it's protection as well. And that would again be from things like orcas, because the orcas can't go into nearly as shallow water along the coast as the belugas can. So this dark black here is that summering area, and you can kind of see the spring migration in with the black arrow, and then you can see the fall migration out. And so we were talking about different subpopulations. I just wanted to bring this up because our whales here in Western Hudson's Bay really do have the longest migratory route. I just kind of snapped this up from Google Maps just to give you an idea. So obviously they're not taking that direct route. They might go a little left or right. Actually, some of them even go above the island up near Ungava there. But the important thing to know is that me just, taking a quick snippet from Google Maps, that's 1,600 kilometers or 1,000 miles, right? That's a huge thing. So they got to go in and out, right? And so last time we were talking about why bother? What's the draw to come all the way down here to the coast of Hudson's Bay? Well, it's about the rivers, right? It has to do with the nutrients that those are transporting in, which is the basis of the whole ecosystem, right? Those are going to be our primary production. That's where our photosynthesis is going to start rolling out. And last time we talked about this in a food sense, and we also talked about it in a maternal sense. So they're coming to the mouths of these rivers to have their calves. That warmer water, safety, food around. But that's actually not the only reason. I kind of held back a little bit last time so I could talk about it all in one go. So another reason that they make such a very long migratory trek is for their skin. Yes, that's right. They're very big on skincare. I think we should somehow make belugas like a L'Oreal commercial. If anyone wants to get on the AI train or knows a connection, I just think this would be hilarious. But they do an part of their migration is so that they can perform their annual molt. So big difference. Unlike you and I, to maintain our skin health, we're kind of losing little bits of skin all the time. Maybe you don't want to think about it too much detail, but you are, and that's totally natural. It's how our body expels waste. It's how it cleans itself. There's all these things that, we're taught in school as little kids that our skin is our biggest organ. And I think we often just think about it as a covering to hold everything else in, but it actually serves so many functions. And it's extremely, extremely important to maintain that skin health. So our whales, we think that they have to do this really long transition, where they have to do this really long migration because trying to shed their skin in the Arctic comes with a lot of energy costs. So unlike other whales who don't live in the poles, they shed their skin like we do. They just shed a little bit at a time, all the time. But the thing about it is that if you live in the high Arctic, it is very, very cold. And in order to shed skin, in order to have that exchange happen, you have to allow your blood to go near the surface of your body. We do that to heat regulate both directions, right? To cool down, to warm up. But for them, they really have to be quite strategic about their heat loss. It's their biggest energy expenditure, hands down. And so instead of having this continual turnover, what's actually happening for them is that they have a buildup of skin throughout the year, and then that is then released in the summertime. So this is kind of what you're looking at here as an example, is that this is a full-on shed. So it's kind of just, we think about this getting a really bad sunburn, but for them, their body sort of builds it up and then allows it to release at a later point. Now, skin, I think, is pretty darn cool. There's all these different layers to it, right? And each one has a different purpose, And so if we actually take a microscopic look underneath or at the skin of a beluga whale, there are 3 layers that you can see here. It's pink because they dye the cells so that they're easier to see. But they split it into 3. So which kind of your stratum internum, medium, externum. It's kind of self-explanatory. Inside, middle, outside. And so what happens when we talk about them building up skin is that it's the stratum externum, so that it just keeps thickening. It's almost like a tree ring, if that's maybe like an easier way to think about it, is that it just keeps thickening and growing, or tree bark. That's a better way to think about it. So it's more like the thickening of the bark on the skin on the outside. And that serves a few different purposes. Again, they do live in a pretty harsh environment. So having a thicker skin, socially and physically, can be a benefit if you're an Arctic whale. But another thing to keep in mind is that skin is not void of life. Not only is the tissue living, but it is covered in life. Our skin has so many organisms on them, and not in a weird, gross way, in a fully normal, healthy way. That is what's keeping you healthy and happy. We might not think about it, but we need all of those microorganisms that live on our skin. And if we get a bad batch of them, not even in the sense of, an infection or things like that, but even just simple things of like cleanliness and things like that, it really, really has huge, huge implications on your overall health. So there is a whole study. This is what I love. Science is so fun. You can find the randomest thing in the randomest corner. So there are actually on belugas and their skin. And when they were looking at a few different subpopulations, kind of spread across the Arctic, and I'll talk about a couple of those. A couple are in Alaska, one's in Cook Inlet, one's in Bristol Bay. So they're looking at some individual belugas from there, and what they found was this one. This guy here is called a Pseudomonas, and that has actually been found on dolphins and whales. Or sorry, other dolphins. Sorry, dolphins are whales. What I'm trying to say is that it's been found on other species of whale as well as seals. That's what I'm trying to say. And so we are starting to get a picture that this might be sort of like a cosmopolitan microbe organism that lives on marine mammals, that is part of their skin biome and their function. So if we kind of take something to think about, this is that, like, again, we're talking about healthy skin being really, really important. And so those layers and how it all comes apart through that molting process. If you go digging back in some old papers, this is from about the 70s, you can kind of tell from the microscopic photos. It's not as pretty and shiny as that bright pink one that was dyed. But again, what they're showing you, so that SE stands for that stratum externum, SI is internum, and then this is the deceased tissue here on the top. That sort of, you can see it peeling away. And so for scale, this little black bar here is 2 millimeters. So that's still something you and I can see. Also, I just want you to get a sense of that's how much their skin is. Or sorry, this is zoomed in, but it's still, they have really thick skin. Like if you ever have the chance to eat matuk, which is eating whale blubber, you can see it's much, much thicker than our skin. Whereas B, we're starting to get more and more under the microscope. But what you can see is just that living layer is intact. And then there's this deceased cells coming off of it. And so I kind of bring this up because we're talking about health and we're talking about how this all comes together. Once that skin once it's beyond the living layer, then it does start to accumulate things we don't want living on us. That's when we can start getting bad bacteria, having a bad microbe, right? And so you and I don't think about it, but shedding our skin, losing that, is a way of keeping us healthy. And it's just as important in the marine ecosystem. And so that tissue, it can build up on the outside. It can be a place for bacteria to breed, things like that. But also just the whole microorganism that is their skin is one way for us to look at their life history, at how their molting is working. It shows their social behavior because, again, they're passing some of these microbes from organism to organism. They're getting them from different places. So the tiny microscopic world of their skin is a reflection of the whole world that they live in, which is pretty freaking amazing. So when we're looking at trying to map through the skin health, they found, I showed you one of the microorganisms that they found on their skin. But what was interesting is that they took samples from a bunch of different subpopulations, and the scientists were a little bit weirded out by the fact that there was fewer commonalities than they would have expected. And the reason why they found this odd, is something called the Anna Karenina principle. That's right. We're bringing in Tolsky. Bet you didn't see that coming in from left field. Okay, so why are a bunch of microbiologists looking at their skin and worrying about Anna Karenina? It has to do with the first line of Tolsky's novel, which is, all happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. This is a key principle that we use in ecology. We use it all over the place. And so Tolsky was kind of stating this in a relationship sense, but it applies to a lot of our world, whether that is broken marriages, collapsing ecosystems, extinction of species. It applies. And essentially what they're saying by that is that healthy individuals will have a similar microbiota, while diseased individuals will deviate from that healthy microbiome. And so this holds true, and then it kind of becomes a feedback loop. So if you are unhealthy and your skin gets unhealthy, then it also then continues another feedback loop and continues that degradation. And this is true in 50% of diseases. The other 50% have different behaviors. They don't follow the Anna Karenina principle, but still, half the time, this feedback loop kicks in. And so it's a really big one. We don't often think about our skin, I think, as much as we should. And this is really true for us, but it is definitely true for beluga whales. They have some pretty intense lives. the picture on the left, you know, with that cute face kind of coming up towards the camera there, I just want you to look. I know some of it looks like wrinkles, but really take a moment and look at the divots. Look at the shape of the nose. Look at the holes. Every single one of those is a scar, right? Those are from, and not in the sense of like fighting, but these are bottom feeders. And so if you're continually rubbing your nose on grit and sand and rocks and things that are sharp, you are cutting yourself a lot, right? So that's the face. Now, if you look at these images from the Krasnova study, so again, look at the top. Look, you can see the scars going across the top. These animals live under sea ice. Ice is sharp. It really is. I know we don't think about it maybe in that sense often enough as we should, but it can really hurt. You know, I remember falling, I was going to say as a kid, but even as an adult and slipping on the ice. And it can really tear through your skin. And so these animals are surfacing near flows. Their backs get scratched up, even on a good day, right? And so for myself, working as a kayak guide, like I will get scratches on my hands and they take weeks to heal if I'm working. Because in the salt water, you and I, we take it for granted that being animals that live in air, our skin produces first a layer of cells that help it heal, and then they stay there. And so your body actually has a little protective coating that it puts on, but every time it gets wet, the way our skin works is that gets washed away and it has to start over. So I have scars on my hand that honestly were the tiniest of scratches at the time, but they scarred because they couldn't heal properly. So beluga skin is actually, and all whale skin, I would say, all marine mammals deserve a very big shout out from L'Oreal or some sort of other skin company. Because it's amazing that their skin is able to stay whole, support a healthy ecosystem, and survive all of this, right? So, yeah, if you do come up and see us, come see us and come see the belugas. Don't be worried when you see their scars. They are there. It's kind of that line of white shows everything. You know, it's like the stains. It's just part of their natural life cycle, and it's part of their story, part of their journey. But I think it's cool to give a nod for how they take care of themselves, how evolution has taken care of themselves. Another cool thing before I leave their scars behind is that we actually use them as identification. So this is a study that was not from Churchill. This one was from the St. Lawrence, so still in Canada. Identifying beluga whales is much harder, say, compared to humpback for a couple of reasons. One, again, if we look at our nice white skin, it's hard, but they also don't breach. And so not only do you not have this thumbprint fluke that has a certain pattern on it that can be quite unique, you have a totally white whale whose body you very rarely see the full extent of. And so what these researchers were doing is that they were using machine learning, to map scars and identify specific individuals, which is pretty amazing when you think about only seeing, maybe 3 or 4 feet of their back at any given time. And so it's giving you an idea of how, as technology progresses, we can hopefully kind of progress along with it and use it for some really quite incredible things out in nature. Now, since I talked about it, this is what I wanted to get to. That's coming. So this is what I'm talking about when we say that skin builds up over time. We kind of looked at it under a microscope, but this is what we would look like as we see the whales. And so we get that yellowish tint. It is most often on their back. It's kind of like, places that are harder to scratch or places that are, again, look at the face, right? The face, which is continually zooming across the bottom when they're bottom feeding, if they're not hunting mid-water column. So that you can see the skin, the old skin has been washed away, but anywhere else it's there. And so during the winter, that coating builds up and thickens, and then it gets lost. Then they come to the mouths of rivers and things like that, and they actually like scratch themselves in the water. So they'll roll over and they'll rub their backs, things like that, to try and shed some of that skin. And we see this not quite in the same way, but for our terrestrial cows, right? So we would call a female beluga whale a cow. So our terrestrial cows also do the same thing. They love a good scratching post. So it's fun to see that our aquatic equivalents are also looking to get a nice back scratch. So again, looking at some of these cool old studies. So when they come to the mouth of the river, they don't lose their skin right away. It's not an overnight thing. It actually takes up to around 6 weeks. So they were saying between 70 and 75 days. for them to shed all of that skin. So that's another reason. They need to come somewhere where they can safely be warm enough to send blood to their surface, and be a little bit vulnerable. And they need to be there for a while, right? So traveling to the mouth of these rivers is what provides a lot of opportunities for things like that. And we can see sort of the process of that in different snapshots of their skin. But you didn't think we'd ever talk this much about beluga skin, did you? So this is 3 different times in a year, and these were sampled. So A, B, and C represent, A is from, let me get this right. A is from the summer. Oh no, sorry. A is from the spring. B and C, C is the fall and the thinnest. B is summer, and then spring. There we go. Sorry, I was trying to read the fine print there, and my eyes were having a hard time. So, right, so that SE, that's that stratum externum. So essentially think about it as once fall comes, that skin keeps building and thickening over the winter. And it has a lot of keratin in it. It's also got a lot of fat. And so it both acts as a protection over the winter time, and then it kind of builds up. So it's, again, serving multiple purposes. And then in the summertime, they scratch it away. And then by the time they leave at the end of summer and it's fall and they're migrating back north, their skin, they've gotten rid of all the old material, they're resetting, and they're going to begin growing that out again. And so they're going to cycle through that every single year as part of their annual molt. All right, I have only a couple more things about skin, I think, and then we'll move on, I promise. You cannot talk about a beluga without talking about the fact that they're white. This is their unique feature, right? White, beluga, the name comes from the Russian word beluga, which means white. In lots of different cultures and other languages, they're usually just called the white whale. And so why is their skin white? What's the deal? Well, we do think that it's an evolutionary advantage tied into camouflage and avoiding predators. Those predators are us. Yes, those are us humans. They are also polar bears, also orcas, right? So all of those things are the biggest, 3 of those are the biggest predators of belugas. And so I have my own little theory in this as well, because I've spent this much time talking about skin. So also skin damage if you don't have a lot of melanin. So that's the pigment that decides what color you are. So because they have an annual molt and then they get rid of it, the dead skin actually might help as some of that protection, but then they have to get rid of it because it's the damaged part. So anything that's sun damaged, if you get rid of your skin, I know for you and I, when we think about peeling with a sunburn, it's not a good thing. So the initial damage is not good, but when you peel, you remove all the damaged skin. So yes, these animals have white skin and they spend actually half the year in darkness and half the year in light, depending on how far north they are, right? And so they don't have to worry about the sunburn in the wintertime, but in the summertime, that can be a bit of a deal. And so it's one way to flush off any skin that's been damaged. Anyways, that's my own Kristina theory. That is not a researched and explained theory. But we see them as adults as white, but they are not born white. They are born with lots of melanin pigment. They're born, what some people like to call this cafe au lait color. It's kind of a gray brownish color. And they're born about 14 or 15 months after gestation. And that initial color is kind of that new skin baby, their new baby skin, in the sense that they're actually going to do their first molt in their life right away within that first month of being born. And so that first molt, which is where I got to learn a fun new word, which is called desquamation. There we go. If we do it, allowing desquamation and leading to a change in skin color. So there's the fun word of today that I've never said before, or at least not before today, out loud. So what that is in the same way that adults are doing it annually, the babies are born with a protective layer from the get-go, and they're going to actually shed that first layer, and then they go from this sort of coffee cream color into more of a darker blue or gray for those first month or so of their lives. And that's kind of the color that they'll have and that they'll then age out of for the following years. So over the next few years, they'll become lighter and lighter, and they'll usually turn white around their 12th or 16th year. So they're 16 is they're a fully white whale. And so when they do that, one thing I really want to point out is that it's not tied to sexual maturity. So beluga whales sexually mature around anywhere from 8 to 10. And so you can see, like, it's a physical progression, but it's not tied to sexual reproduction, which I wanted to clarify that. Because we often, associate these morphological changes with sexual reproduction, because it is really common in a lot of species, but in this case, they're separate. So what's happening, the reason why they're going white, is because the abundance of these pigments is decreasing with age, until eventually there's no more pigment at all, right? So just as a reminder, melanin, right, the stuff that decides how well you tan, you genetically start with so much, your body's able to produce it, and it controls things not just like how dark your skin is, but also controls even your eye color, things like that, and your hair. It's the same pigments that dictate that. Now, the reason why beluga whales lose melanin over time is because the actual gene coding shuts it off. So over time, right, every single time we lose some of those cells in our skins, new ones have to get made, and they get copied and replicated through our DNA. And that DNA can actually have on and off switches, where in the sense that every time the replication happens, it stops replicating so many numbers of the same copy. DNA is very cool. It's like a very complicated copy machine, and you can tell it, your body tells it to do different things as you age. That actually pretty much is what aging is. It's how your genes change. And obviously, injuries, accumulations, all those fun things too. Experiences. I shouldn't say aging is only genetic. There's so much more to it. Okay, so there we go. This is why belugas are white. It has to do with their pigment, but also I hope that you will come to appreciate not only maybe a beluga's skin, but also your own skin and how important skin health is, and just how, in and of itself, these amazing things happen literally microscopically under our nose. And so it's good to just, say thank you to your skin microorganisms from time to time for keeping you healthy and keeping you happy. Okay. All right. So I'm going to bring it back. We'll bring it back into the Arctic. We'll zoom out, at least away from the skin. Anyways, go a little bit more macro. So here's our map again. That little green star is where Churchill is. We now know that belugas are migrating, 1,000 miles each way to get in and out to reach these grounds, these submarine grounds, for their food, to molt their skin, to have their calves. But one thing I want to think is really important, and I'm a really big map person. I was a geographer and a biologist and maybe a couple other ologists. And maps are amazing. They allow us to conceptualize things in this way that, a picture is worth 1,000 words. It kind of always sums it up, right? But it allows you to draw connections. It allows you to see things in a whole different way that words simply can't do. But one thing about maps that I find is always quite dangerous is that it shows you something as static. It gives the impression that this is how things have been and this is how things will always be. And I think that's especially true. I mean, this is just ecological boundaries, right? But here's a very classic example is, geopolitical borders. If you look at a time snap, highly suggested, if anyone wants to go Google this after the webinar, look at like Europe's borders over the last 3,000 years or 2,000 years, whatever it is. And you see them change really quickly. And it changes your perception of where we fit into this, right? This is beluga distribution in my lifetime. It's how I understand it. The next person's lifetime and the one after that and so on and so forth is not going to stay the same for various reasons. And that's kind of what we're gonna dive into next. So for those of us who were with us in part 1, if you can remember, we talked about where belugas actually evolved from. And our belugas, believe it or not, they're all Italians. To be specific, they're from Tuscany. Well, okay, they're not from Tuscany, but some of the oldest fossils that we can find of what we would now call a beluga is from Tuscany. We think that they went extinct about 3 million years ago, but the sort of earliest common ancestor that we can agree on being a beluga was hanging out on Earth around 5 million years ago. And what happened was something changed and all the warm waters belugas went extinct, and it was the cold water ones that survived. So what we know as belugas are actually the youngest of the cousins, and the older warm body ones didn't make it after through so many changes. And what happened? Well, the world is changing all the time. Big scales, small scales, local, regional. But we've gone through a few pretty distinct ones. So one of those that we're kind of coming out of now was the last glacial maximum. That was 21,000 years ago, was kind of when we were at the peak and then started warming back up. And then again, we have little blips in and out of it too, right? So we had what's called the Little Ice Age about 500 years ago. And what this is showing you is it's just showing you surface temperature sort of spread across the world, right? And so when we look at this temperature-wise, but we are thinking about belugas. And when we think about belugas, we want to think about up north. And so Canada, right, if we think about Hudson's Bay here, tucked in, Churchill's kind of right there on the dot. Oops, one too many. One moment, take me back. There we go. So the picture on the right is what Canada looked like 21,000 years ago. Almost all of it was covered in ice. And it was like that up until, like, even some of the northern states were still had ice covered 15,000 years ago. And then it kind of begins to thin and shrink. And so actually Hudson's Bay, hanging out there in the center, was not clear until about 8,000 years ago. So those 50,000 belugas that currently call Hudson's Bay home, they were not there. All of this, nope, it was not accessible. There was the Laurentide ice sheet, which, to give you some perspective, it was bigger than all of Antarctica in volume. It had huge effects on the entire climate, right? And so that meant that all of the Arctic was not accessible to our beluga friends. So, and this is not the first time this has happened either, right? So I said belugas evolved around 5 million years ago. And even in just the last million years, there have been 10 glacial cycles. So really, really cold, lots of ice, less cold, less ice. And we've popped in and out of these 10 times in the last million years. And the last one that we kind of came out of started about 110,000 years ago. And it ended about 20,000 years ago. And so far this narrative, and you can often really learn someone's perspective, but so far I've been narrating this from a terrestrial perspective, right? What that means is that I've been talking about all the ice on land. Well, it was a big ice cube in the entire Arctic. It's just a whole big ice cube. That was what was. Multi-year ice that would have literally been, 20, 30 plus feet thick, right? That is blocking out sunlight. The amount of organisms that can live down there is minimal. If we don't have access to the sun, and then I'll add on the fact that it's terribly, terribly cold, life really dwindles. And so everything gets pushed out at that point. And so what happens to our belugas then? What's going on here? Well, there we go. We can actually track through genetics when some of these things happened. So this is our beluga population here. And we have got 4 different sort of genetic groups that we follow. And we've been doing this through, there we go, that's what I want to get to. We're doing this through haplotypes, but I'm going to explain what that is. But I just wanted to give a shout out to the study first. So they did a demographic history. So they essentially followed the history of populations of beluga whales through the past 25,000 years, which is a pretty cool thing to be able to say, I would say. So what I want to point out first is that these 4 different colors here are 4 different lineages. And so they've kind of given them names based off of where the genomes were first sequenced or where the whales are from. So the blue line is Greenland. The green line is us in Churchill, it's Canada. The red line is one of the Alaska populations in Bristol Bay. And then the yellow line is the Cook Inlet population. And what I want to point out here is that changes in, it's a little squishy. Sorry, that's hard to read. So the very bottom graph, you can see that says thousands of years ago, kind of going back. And then what that very bottom one is, the one that we're interested in, is called sea surface temperature. So if it was really warm, right? And so what I want you to see is that they were all essentially very similar until that kind of until just before that that really big glacial maximum kicks in 110,000 years ago. That's what they're showing right here, is this gray bar. And then after that, they diverge. So what that means is that all the populations had roughly similar lifestyles and things going on. And then things get cold, giant ice cube now exists, and all these populations get pushed to the fringes. And some do better, some do worse, right? Now, that was in the past. And then this is the next last glacial maximum. So we can see that we're cooling down. Sorry, other way around. We're warming up. So we're coming out of the cold period, and look at what's happening to our populations. They're starting to expand again and starting to spread out. So everyone, we're going to get real nerdy here for at least the next 10-15 minutes. Because even though I'm not going to lie, I almost failed my genetics class back in biology, I love genetics as a story. This is the reason why I didn't do good in genetics. I could not memorize all of the sequences because half of the multiple choice questions were just series of letters, and I was awful at it. I barely passed. Thankfully, I did pass, so I did get my biology degree. I didn't have to redo it, but it was a nightmare. But I love going back to genetics because I love how it explains everything, and I love how the story comes together. And so if science scares you, if biology scares you, please don't close your eyes. Please don't hide from them. We're going to do this in a really fun way. Hopefully bring up some things you remember, and maybe even bring up some things that maybe you slept through on the first time going through biology class. Okay, so how in the world are we finding out genetics from 25,000, 100,000 years ago? How is that possible? Well, you and I, every single one of us, we are a living, breathing story of our genetic history. And the way that works is we get passed down different things from our parents through the form of chromosomes. Chromosomes comes in pairs, but what actually happens is that within those pairs, you can get unique ones from each parent. So that's kind of what this is showing you here. A haplotype, haplo is in half, right? Half of each chromosome has its own, they're the same gene, but it's its own trait within the gene. So, if we look at the top pair here, everywhere orange and blue are paired, they're the same, but they can actually have different, orange can be a redhead and blue can be a brunette, right? But it's still the hair gene in that section. That's the point I'm getting at. It's the function is paired horizontally, and then the colors can be different traits. That's what's so cool about genetics. That's how we get all the missy-matchy of things. And so from, this is how come I kind of look like my sister, but I also kind of don't, right? Because I got some of the genes from my mom, some from my dad, but then those pairs get to mesh in their own way, getting into lots of fun diversity. And so I showed you I showed the pairs sort of lined up and nice and even and functional for the sake of just showing you how the pairs can cross back and forth. So if we imagine those two blue lines, that X of the chromosome, that's just the green one and the purple one overlapped on each other. And that's what then makes up your pair. And then this is the blueprint to who and what we are, right? And they get passed down sequentially. For us humans, we've got 23 of these pairs, right? So we've got a total of 46. If you're a beluga, or actually if you're most marine mammals, so the left side here is humans, and we have 46 in total, right? So those 23 pairs. Whales have 22 pairs, and almost all of them do. There's only 7 species that have a different amount. They have 42. Excuse me. And so it's one of the reasons why there's a lot of hybridization in marine mammals and in certain whales and certain dolphins. So it's because they're still so genetically similar. And that's true for belugas. They can cross with narwhals. You can call them a narluga if you want. It's very cute. So there you go. You're looking at some of the genetic pairs of our whales. Now, those pairs in that sort of chaotic scrambling of passing down who gets which one, as they get passed down, and if your children survive and those traits survive, looky who, your patterns get passed down. And so that's what they were able to track. They were able to track these haploid types through time and through space. So remember I said the 4 different places before. So green is from the Churchill sequence. Purple, or that blue, is kind of from the Greenland sequence. Yellow is from Alaska, but a small one, what's left now anyways. Clade B is from Cook Inlet. And then Bristol Bay there is linked to Alaska. And so the first thing I want you to notice is that actually, you know what? Let's actually take a minute and walk through this because this is kind of a fun one. So if we look at that kind of crazy spider web of what's going on, the circles, each circle indicates how often that genetic marker comes up, and they can come up in any of the belugas from all around, right? So it's how often do they come up, and then the size of the circle. Size of the circle is the frequency, and then there are 135 individual little markers. Go back to that chromosome. Remember when I said there's like the hair section? So there's there's these 35 individual markers that they were able to track these populations. So there's 35 little dots, and then the size of the dot is how often it comes up, right? And so really what that's just showing you is that there are some common ancestors that we have markers of. So this is kind of a cool one. Like if you look in the center of C, they didn't find the common ancestor. Like there wasn't the existing haploid, that is gone, but the survivors of it, and the ones that branched out from it, are there. Versus if you look at over in D, you can see that, hey, we found lots from the common marker that are still alive today, and we found a lot of these peripheral ones. So it's kind of, we often, we like to show genetics really linearly, but this is a really fun way of showing you how genetics can play out. So it's kind of like the actual genes, and then let's look at the map for a second, right? So now you can see that, again, those genetics are tied to historical locations, or at least where the genomes were sequenced, but it doesn't mean that that's where they only exist. You see lots of genetic crossover in different belugas all around the Arctic. So it's pretty freaking cool. So this is looking at it in space. We can also snoop through their genetics in time, right? So again, here's those 4 colors again. Churchill is the green one with the C. That was very convenient of them to do that. Thank you for making it a C. And we can see where those different clades split off from one another. So A is the oldest branch. It's the most unique. It has the most genetically distinct from the other 3. And then B broke off from the other pair of C and D. So C and D have the most in common, and then they're kind of more distant cousins as you move up towards A. Now, if we go down and we look at where some of these choice points, we'll call them, evolutionary points happen, this is what I want to point out. So this other squiggly line, this fun blue line here at the bottom, shows you the mean global sea level. So it is really hard to know how much ice is in the world, especially historically. We're trying to figure it out now. Forget about trying to figure it out 10,000 or 600,000 years ago. But what we use as a proxy for figuring out how cold our world was is the sea level, which is actually much easier to track because the sea leaves different erosional banks all around the world, and we can actually map that fairly well. And so there's a mark here. It gets pretty low. So this again instigates that there's a cold time. So if there's a cold time, our Arctic turns back into a big ice cube, right? Now, that ice cube, as it forms, yes, here's my other sea level map. This is our, again, we've been talking about a lot of things. I've been trying to shift the narrative to marine, I guess is what I'm trying to get at. So we're looking at how the sea ice is changing. We're doing that based off of sea level. And there's a really important thing that happens at 50 meters below present. That's kind of right in the middle here. So any more time you see that happen, sort of 600,000 years ago, about 400,000 years ago, looks it happens. Oh, look at here we go. We're right back into that 110 period. So if we go below, or if it drops that much by 50 meters, so about 150 feet, something that I think most people are familiar with is that the continents get connected. That's right. If we drop that low, then the Bering land bridge forms. And we often talk about this, at least terrestrially, we talk about it as a connector. We talk about how species changed, how we think people traveled across the land bridge and, connected, and how populations then occupied North America. We talk about the Bering Land Bridge as a bridge. Even in the name, we call it a bridge. But if you're a marine mammal, this is not a bridge. This disconnects you, right? This is one of the big reasons why we have these these differences in genetics, is because they get sectioned off, right? So the belugas are happily existing on either side, and the populations eventually become separated, and then they become more unique and genetically distinct as that time goes by, which is pretty wild. So, right, that is one of the big moments. We've got the one in the past where they get separated from each other. And so they all got separated, they differentiated, and then as it warms up, they have a chance to cross over again. Now, this one here is showing you since the last glacial maximum. We can see sort of another sort of genetic takeoff again, if you want to call it that, or the potential for one, maybe is a better way to say it. We're not quite sure yet where this is going. But something I wanted to point out, which I thought was interesting, is that since the last glacial maximum, so since about 20,000 years ago, 25,000 years ago, there have been 800 generations of beluga whales, assuming roughly a 30-year lifespan. which also I would put an asterisk on that because belugas live longer than 30 years, but there's a little science battle going on about how old belugas are. But we're going to table that for now. We're going to talk about generations. 800 generations, which is a lot and also not. It's kind of an interesting one to suddenly think about. So if I humanize this for a second, right? So for us to go back 25,000 years, if we live for approximately 80 years, let's just rough this here, that's roughly 300 lifespans. And in some ways, when we think about that generationally, it feels really overwhelming. But if you think about it laterally, if I think about people in my own peer group, I can easily think of 300 people, right? And so, but time-wise, the reason why things get so much more harder to comprehend is because of the amount of genetic diversity going back in time. So as a fun sort of thought process for just a moment here, if we have a family tree with 100 generations, that means that you're going to have like thousands upon thousands of ancestors. Now, in reality, we actually don't have that many. There was 1.2 times 10 to the 30 ancestors if we go back 100 generations. But that's not actually how it works because you have something that's called pedigree collapse. So that's what this diagram on the right is showing you, is that eventually if you go far enough back, someone is related to someone else. Hate to tell you, that's kind of how she goes. We just know that biologically it's not a good idea to do that. You don't have to, because it keeps you healthier. Again, skin healthy, genetics healthy, all things that we want. And so there's 800, if we go back to our belugas for a second, there's 800 generations there. And I think one thing that's really important, lifespans overlap. And with those lifespans that overlap, so does knowledge, right? I think this is much more famous for orcas. They're a little bit more well known, but they live in family groups, right? And those family groups, at least for orcas, are functioning as matriarchs. And so that means that every one of those 800 generations passes information down. Now, belugas are not as strongly matriarchal. They still are. They're a matriarchal society. However, they are different from orcas in the sense that they often mix family groups. They'll have larger genetic diversity between them. And so their kinship bonds are different. They're less dependent on their immediate family. And so that changes also the knowledge transfer. So this is kind of cool. This is a picture of a pod, and it's showing you which lineage, which of the pod members came from. And so a pod hunts together, lives together, protects each other, right? And so you're seeing that they're protecting each other who are not necessarily family and not necessarily related, which when we think about that is really quite highly developed to be able to step away from that and step back into it. So they have to think that there's an advantage to it. And we're going to get to that, I promise. I'm recognizing we're almost on time, but I'm going to squeeze in the last few slides here. So there's a couple theories behind this. One, because of their highly developed vocal communication, we think that even when they're not living in their immediate family group, when they form these non-kinship bonds, they still know where their family relatively is within the same migratory route. And then the second part of it is that there are benefits to having not family members in your core circle. So what belugas have is what we call a fission-fusion society. It means that they often get together in large groups, then they split up, and then they get back together and split up. And they do this as part of their migratory cycle. So winter is their socializing time. It's when all of the groups get together. They do a little switch around of who lives with who. Maybe Steve goes over there and Susan goes over there now. See you again next year. Now, it also means that what Steve and Susan know to their respective pods gets taken with them. So they have a lot more lateral knowledge transfer than, for an example, an orca would. All right, so let's bring all this together. So this is kind of in the past. I've brought us up to, we've got 800 generations of belugas. This was all a big ice cube over time, right? And that ice cube starts to melt. That's great. It's melting away, and all of a sudden, this new area gets opened up. So the whales, we kind of I might have only talked about this in part 2, but I'll just bring it up quickly. So they're very, very loyal to their migratory routes. These pods, they follow the same circuit year after year as a social cohesion. So how is it that they knew or went to look for even areas beyond this orange? So that's what this is here. So what you're looking at on the far left is this is where the belugas would have been living. That was their habitat 20,000 years ago. And so in order to go to places like Hudson's Bay here in the center, they had to find their way there, right? Well, I used to really like playing Catan. It's all about expansion, exploration, the other C word, which is colonization, but we'll leave that one up for now. So how did they get beyond this, right? Well, again, if we go back to part 2, it has to do with your social order. If you are a male, I'm going to bring both part 1 and part 2 kind of in all together to close this out. So in part 1, we talked about how males have a greater diving capacity. They actually have, per volume of blood, more hemoglobin and hematocrit to carry oxygen, which means that they can dive further, farther, and longer. So they are both physiologically built to travel farther. They also have a more of an exploratory foraging pattern. They go deeper and they go farther than females do. They will sometimes form all male pods and they'll circle out. So what that means is that males do the exploration and then they come back. And then when they come back, they swap social spheres and then everyone learns what everyone else knows. It's a really actually amazing example in nature of co-learning, because that's how they're able to find new regions. It's how they keep a stable central core functioning around a largely matriarchal society, how the males take turns, and how it shows that you can benefit by spending time with not just your immediate friends. It's pretty darn cool. All right. So that brings us kind of to the present. Now, this study does one step further, and it's really cool. It goes into the future. So it says, hey, based on where our sea ice is going, what is the population going to look like? So orange was the past. Orange was 25,000 years ago. Light blue is the present. That's kind of where we find most belugas now, where the really good habitat is. And then pink is this projected future. And the thing I want you to notice, so the bar graph, the 3 here, that's just showing you like the area available for them to live in. So we can see that right now they have more than what they did 25,000 years ago, but in 100 years, they're going to have less, I guess 75 years now. And then if we look at where on the earth they're living, so latitude wise, they're having to go further north as it gets warmer, because that ice habitat is dwindling, right? And so our belugas will have to travel further on that migratory route. They're still going to come all the way back to Churchill. Their food availability will change. Also predators from the south, right? So orcas don't have a chance to prey on belugas most of the year because they can't handle the sea ice. They have a dorsal fin. They would actually get hurt. So it's one of the things that's it's a natural barrier to predation. So things like that are changing. And that forecast, when we think about it genetically, so the further south populations, like our Hudson's Bay one, this is also in Canada. This is the St. Lawrence, and there are belugas there. So these little side populations are likely the ones to suffer the most as our populations retreat north. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that if I go back, right, so if we think about it genetically, there are different genetics in each population. Oops, I went too far first. Let's go back to St. Lawrence for a second. So the St. Lawrence population has some of the clade A. So if you can remember that, this is the oldest branch. It's the most unique branch of all of our existing belugas, which means that they have the most genetically diverse DNA. And that means that, diversity is always a good thing, right? Diversity means resilience. Diversity means coming back from that. And so if this population is threatened, just by losing the one small population, we actually lose about a third of the genetics. Well, that's an exaggeration. Maybe about 10 or 15%. Depends on which one you would lose. Right. So it just goes to show that these smaller populations, like St. Lawrence is estimated to be about 1,000 whales, give or take a little bit. But they carry 1,000 out of 200,000 doesn't seem like a lot, but genetically they carry way more information than just their small population does. So it's things to think about, or a different way to think about how populations can be affected. All right, so let's bring this back in. If we bring it back to Hudson's Bay, there are about 50,000 whales. So I said at the very beginning, that's, depending on the population estimate, somewhere between a third and a quarter of all of the population in the world. Now, genetically, if we zoom in on Hudson's Bay and we go back to our friends here, where everyone's genetics has come from, Hudson's Bay has a really great example of 3 out of the 4 clades. So it has a little bit of that St. Lawrence one that I was talking about. And then it also has both of the other clades. So it doesn't have any of the Cook Inlet clades. So there's a different genetic diversity there, different offshooting branches. But it goes to show that protecting an area like Western Hudson's Bay, like Churchill, right? That resilience that we're talking about for these whales to have gone through 10 glaciations in a million years and survived all different that. It has to do with the strength of your diversity. So it's one of the great reasons to come and see Hudson's Bay. And hopefully, if you are coming up there to see it, you can think about things that are going on beyond our sight, something on the microscopic level, whether that's their DNA, whether that's their skin. Hopefully just have a chance to see the world in a whole new way. And I will call her there. Apologies, I'm a tad over time.
All right, Kristina, thank you so much. All right, before we dive into the questions, I would like to remind everyone that if you do have questions, you can submit them via the question field in your control panel. Just go to the upper right-hand corner, click on those 3 lines, and it'll drop down the menu, click on questions, and submit them in there. So, Kristina, how long is the average lifespan of a beluga?
Yeah, so in the wild, it's sort of that plus 30 to 40, or yeah, the lifespan question changed because the way that they were checking how old they were was actually their teeth. So in the same way that a tree has rings, their teeth have rings as they grow. And previously they thought that in the same way there's kind of a tree, there's a light and a dark. They thought that the two was a single year, and then they eventually realized that actually each ring represented a single year, and so there's a bit of a controversy at one point. So upwards of 60 is actually how old they can live. That being said, there's only ever been a few whales recorded at 50 years old, so the average lifespan would more be in the high 30s.
Perfect. Gotcha. Thank you. So here's an interesting question. How is it that belugas sleep? How long do they sleep for? And do they come up for air? How does that happen?
Yeah. So like all our marine mammal friends, they are able to shut off their brain partially at a time. I know we shut off our brains, but jokingly, we shut it all off. When we go to sleep, all of us goes into a different mode. So for whales, because they do need to sleep, they do sleep fully submerged. They don't sleep at the surface. And they're shutting off half of their brain at a time, going to that REM cycle, and the other half of their brain stays awake and aware so that it knows when to come up to breathe. Sleeping bouts, again, right, so their capacity to hold their breath kicks in. They'll be sleeping in sort of that like 15, sort of 20-minute range. There's a lot of napping. They're a species of naps.
Gotcha. Thank you. So you mentioned on our NatHab trip that there would be orcas in Hudson Bay. So while we're in the kayaks or the zodiacs, are we concerned about belugas or orcas tipping the kayaks or the zodiacs?
Okay, my apologies. I'm going to correct that one right away. It is extremely, extremely, extremely rare to see an orca. They might get sighted once every 3 or 5 years. And they also can't come into the mouth of the river. It's too shallow for them largely. The reason why I brought that up in the beginning, sorry if that caused a bit of they can come into the general part of Hudson's Bay, and locals do see them, but like it's an extremely rare sighting. And so that study was cool because it showed just that like there had been an orca around in the last 3 or 4 days because their skin tissue was in the water. Not that anyone actually saw it. So just to clear that one up. And so then the second part, do we have to worry about that? So no, you don't have to worry about orcas in the water, but yes, if you are coming kayaking, the belugas are very curious, right? You're something for them to come check out. They're not intentionally trying to spook you. They're just extremely curious, inquisitive creatures. And they are known to give a boat a little nudge. They might, especially some of the younger ones might come and check out what you are. They'll often follow the bubbles behind the zodiac. So sometimes we're out on a kayak. If you are joining us for a beluga trip, or if you're interested, so the way the tours are currently running is there are 2 opportunities to kayak, just based on the fact that weather in the subarctic is very temperamental. So we have 2 different opportunities to go out, so that if one doesn't work, the other one's still good, or you have the chance to go twice, which is great. And then the third opportunity to go out on the water is to go out on a zodiac, so in a boat. So even if kayaking is not your thing, I'm biased because I'm a kayaker and I love it. But if kayaking is not your thing, you can still absolutely come to the tour, still come and be on the boat and see whales that way, as well as all the other things that we're doing when we're not on the water. So don't have to worry about orcas. you do have to pay attention while you're kayaking. And honestly, it's about staying calm and just keeping your paddle in the water. It's very good. And also this is a big thing when taking groups out paddling. Actually, the worst thing that happens if someone falls in the water is mostly your ego and maybe a bit of a chuckle. And we give you a round of applause and congratulate you, and you get pulled back out in the Zodiac, and it's a story for later. Don't worry too much if that's a fear in mind. It's all good.
So how cold is the water when I go up there next week?
Oh, nice. Awesome. Happy you're going to make it up there. So yeah,
Well,
the bay
not me,
itself. No, whichever person is sending you the question. Yeah, so the bay itself is going to be honestly probably around 6 degrees Celsius. So what would that be in Fahrenheit? Just over, like, would that be 40? Am I doing the math right?
I believe
40,
so, yes.
low 40s? Somewhere in there. Sorry, my Celsius Fahrenheit conversion. I haven't had to do it since bear season, so I pull it out for you guys. That's my one thing. I learn it every year, and then I forget it every year.
Well, we never actually learn it, so that's the difference. So how many people would be joining me on the Beluga trip?
Yeah, it depends on which trip you've signed up for. So if you're on a photography trip, I believe you'll be traveling as a total of 14 plus your guide. If you are on a naturalist trip, you'll have 16. Either way, still lots of space. It's kind of the perfect amount to make a few friends, but also like have the space on your own to spend time. So yeah, no, it's a pretty good time, and that's awesome. If you're going up next week, you might actually, if you are going up next week, you might even be on my trip. Depends on what your start day is. If not, I'll come say hi. You'll see me in, I'm sure, one of the stops in town.
Thank you for that, Kristina. I'm sure they will. Well, unfortunately, that is going to be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'd like to hand it back to you for any closing comments you may have for us.
Just want to say thank you, everyone, for taking some time out of your day to learn about a world that is very far away. I find that, it's hard to connect to something that you don't understand. And the Arctic is such a foreign place. I think, having spent, quite a bit of my own time doing research, it's a world fresh to understand, but it's even more amazing underneath the water. And so because we have such a hard time conceiving that, any little window that we can open into it, I think it's just a great way to connect and to just bring that awareness, right? Right. I think we all want what's best for this world in so many different ways. And sometimes we don't even know what that is because we haven't had a chance to have exposure to it. So just thank you, everyone, for taking some time out of your day to learn some new aspects about our big, beautiful world.
Kristina, thank you so much for teaching us some new things about our world and taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who joined us. So if you are interested in information on how you could travel to see belugas with NatHab, please give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. Now, you can check out this week's lineup, including our registration links, on the website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We will see you next time.